Okay, I'm slightly conscious of time, so I'm quite keen just to launch into this. I've had something that's been on my heart now for a very long time, and for whatever reason, I've just not quite been able to get it out. Although I managed to get it out at New Life Conference to the young people in the youth tent, so I apologise for those who were in the youth tent. You've heard much of this before. But before it was on my heart for the young people there, it was very much on my heart for us here, which I think is why I've just not been able to shake it. And it's just been there in the back of my mind for a long time, so I'm keen just to give it. And I've been listening this morning desperately for some encouragement that what I've got to share is in line with what's already going on, and I think I've heard that, unless I'm just so desperate I'm hearing anything I want. I think I'm hearing some of the themes that I'd like to talk on, so I'm just going to kind of go for it and just trust that it's beneficial to us. So I'm going to look at a passage in Mark's Gospel. It's Mark chapter 11, starting at verse 12 through to verse 26. And what I found interesting about this passage is that it shows an aspect of Jesus' character that I don't feel like I see anywhere else in the Gospels. And it's really quite shocking what you see in Jesus in this passage. We'll read it in a second. And you kind of ask the question, why is he reacting and responding in the way that he is? And to me, it seems like he's wanting to shock his people into a response. So let's just read it and we can go through it bit by bit. So it's Mark 11, verse 12 through to verse 26. We may not get all the way through. We'll see how we get on. So he's just done the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And so the next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. And when he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. So he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. And on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers?" The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. And in the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. And Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed is withered." "Have faith in God," Jesus answered. "I tell you the truth, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go, throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you." Okay, so we have these two events. We've got the cursing of the fig tree, and then we've got the cleansing of the temple, and they're kind of linked. Jesus is kind of giving the same message through both of these accounts. And as I said, there's something shocking about his response. You know, this is Jesus, meek and mild, Jesus, friend of sinners, and yet here he is cursing a fig tree because there's no fruit on it, and casting people out of the temple. And you start thinking, what on earth is going on in Jesus that's provoking this kind of response? And I think at first reading, it can almost seem a little bit harsh, what Jesus is doing. But when you look a little bit closer, actually what you see is just this passionate love of God, this passionate love of Jesus towards his people, that he doesn't want them to be in this dangerous position that they find themselves in these two situations. So the first thing that I think is really important to note in this whole account is that Jesus was hungry. And I think that's really interesting. Jesus is hungry. He's hungry for fruit. In this passage, he's hungry for fruit. And today, for us, he's hungry for fruit. He's hungry to see fruit in our lives. He's hungry for kind of the evidence that we have his life in us. We've heard some of this, I think, already this morning. He's hungry and he's looking for fruit amongst his people. And it's interesting that it's important probably to note that when we talk about fruit, I think I've fallen into the trap before of thinking that my fruit is kind of what I do. But I don't think that's the kind of fruit that we're talking about here. Fruit, perhaps what we do is better represented by the leaves on the tree, the things that are visible to people. But the fruit is more of a kind of a character. And the fruit that Jesus is looking for in this passage is the fruit of true worship. And it's the fruit of the Spirit in his people, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. I think that's all of them. That's the kind of fruit that he's looking for amongst his people. And so you get the sense that Jesus is hungry here, and he's hungry amongst his people here today. He's looking for fruit. It's evidence that we're his people. And it's not the sense that he's kind of here to test us, that he's kind of planted this life in us and then he's gone away and he's come back and he's just checking up on us to make sure we're doing what we should be doing. It's not that kind of hunger for fruit. It's a more of a kind of like an attentive gardener who's just keen to see that his trees are healthy, that there's a life in them, that it's producing good fruit, and that it's not just kind of on the outside. The trees don't just look good on the outside, but there's real life inside them that's producing fruit. Okay, so Jesus in this passage, he's hungry, and he's looking for fruit, and he sees this beautiful fig tree full of leaves, and he goes over to try and find a fig, and he finds nothing. And so he curses the fig tree. And a bit later on, or the next day, we find that the tree is withered right down to its roots. And you think, oh yeah, it does seem a little bit unfair, particularly when it says it wasn't the season for figs. You think, Jesus, what's going on? Why are you doing this? And I think the issue that Jesus had with this tree was that it had leaves. So there's a couple of things we need to know about fig trees. I learned something a few weeks ago from Paul. I think you said, Paul, that fig trees need restriction in their roots to be able to flourish. I thought that was interesting. But also, a fig tree produces fruit either slightly before or at least at the same time as its leaves. Okay, so that's just how fig trees work. They produce fruit slightly before or at the same time as their leaves. So when Jesus saw this fig tree, even though it wasn't the season for figs, it was promising something that it didn't have. Because it was full of leaves, there should have been fruit on the tree. So when Jesus sees it, I'm sure there were other trees without any leaves. Jesus didn't go to those ones. This one looked different because it was covered in leaves, therefore there should have been fruit. And so he goes over to get a fig, and when he finds that there's none, he curses the fig tree. Still seems ever so slightly harsh, doesn't it? But what Jesus is doing here is incredibly purposeful. He's not just kind of acting with a kind of divine frustration because he's hungry and there's no figs. He's aware that in the Old Testament, the fig tree represented Israel. And the people that were watching this whole thing unfold, they would have known that was what the fig tree represented. It was representing Israel. And so Jesus is effectively enacting a parable for the people that are watching. And what he's saying is that his people, they look great on the outside. They're covered in leaves. They've got everything. They've got the law. They've got the prophets. They've got history. They've got the temple. They've got all the form. They've got the priesthood. They've got the sacrificial system. They've got feasts. All these wonderful things that make them look absolutely fantastic. But when Jesus goes for closer inspection, because he's hungry not for the leaves, he's hungry for fruit. He's hungry for the evidence that there's his life in them. He finds nothing, and he's effectively saying to these people, you look great on the outside, but on the inside, there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect in your heart towards me. And we read it elsewhere, don't we? I think it's Matthew 15, verse 8. It says, these people, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And that's what Jesus is kind of saying to these people as he comes and curses this fig tree. He's saying to them, I'm hungry for evidence of real life in you, and I can see a whole load of leaves, but there's no fruit. There's a disconnect in your heart. And the end result of that disconnect in your heart is that you will wither and eventually die. That's kind of the outworking of that kind of life, looking the part on the outside, but a disconnect in the heart from God. There's a withering and a dying. Jesus doesn't want his people to wither and die. I think that's why he curses the fig tree. I think we know this is true, don't we? That when we try and live the life that we think we should live without the life of God in us, it's absolutely exhausting, it's miserable. And there is an inevitable withering that comes when we try and live that way. We need his life in us. And Jesus is saying, he's kind of doing this, he's enacting this parable as a way to shock his people. He wants to effectively wake them up. He wants them to see that this is the end. This is what's coming if a heart is disconnected, no matter what they looked like on the outside. And so his heart isn't to curse the fig tree. His heart is that he wants his people to be fruitful. He wants them to be covered in leaves and fruit. The leaves aren't unimportant, but it's the fruit that he's hungry for. And we see this incredible heart of God in another parable in Luke chapter 13, verse 6 to 9. And I love this parable. It's a really short one. So Luke chapter 13, 6. He says, "Then Jesus told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit on it, but he did not find any. So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard," other translations have the vine dresser, he said to the vine dresser, "For 3 years now I've been coming to look for fruit on this fig tree, and I haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil?" Verse 8, "Sir," the man replied, the vine dresser replied, "leave it alone for 1 more year, and I'll dig around it and I'll fertilize it. And if it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, then you can cut it down." And I just think in this parable, we get to see the heart of God for his people. Within the context of this cursing of the fig tree, God's heart is that he wants his people to be fruitful. So in this parable, the man, the kind of the owner of this fig tree, if you like, has spent 3 years trying to get this fig tree to bear fruit. And I think the 3 is significant because it suggests that this man has given this fig tree absolutely everything it could possibly need to bear fruit. It's given it 3 years, all the time it could possibly need. It suggests that it's not just a detached thing. He's been investing in this tree for 3 years. And really, there shouldn't be anything else it needs to produce fruit, and yet it's still not producing fruit. And then in verse 8, you hear the heart of God. When he talks to the vine dresser, he says, "Cut it down." And the vine dresser, knowing that this tree's had everything it could possibly need, the vine dresser, Jesus, says, "Give it 1 more year. Give it 1 more year. Let me tend to it. Let me give it its, my personal kind of investment. Let me give it everything I've got. Let me get down in the dirt and dig around its base. Let me fertilize it. Let me put manure around it. Let me prune it. Let me do anything I can to get this tree to bear fruit. Give it 1 more year. I know it's had all the time it could possibly need." But Jesus says, give it 1 more year. And I think that's the heart of God towards all of us. It's the heart of God towards his people. We've been given absolutely everything we could possibly need and more to bear fruit. We've been given all the time we could possibly need and more. We've been given all the love we could possibly need and more. All the grace and more. This is God's heart towards his people. He's not going there to kind of just shock them and curse this fig tree for no sake. He wants to shock them into a response because he doesn't want them to be fruitless. He wants them to be fruitful, and he's giving them and given them everything they could possibly need and more. The personal attention of God, Jesus, down in the dirt, digging, pruning, maybe doing some things that are uncomfortable, but anything to get this tree to bear fruit. And yet still, at the end of both of these little parables, we get this kind of sober reminder that actually the prospect of being cut down or withering is a very real prospect. That if we remain unfruitful, if there remains this disconnect in our heart towards the Lord, no matter how brilliant we look on the outside, no matter what activity is going on, if there's a disconnect, we will wither eventually, and there will be a cutting down. And so it's a sober reminder, and I think that's why Jesus reacts so strongly in this parable, because he just doesn't want his people to wither. He wants them to flourish. He wants fruit to grow, fruit of true worship, fruit of the Spirit. And so he's trying to shock his people. We then kind of move on, and he finishes with the the fig tree, and he heads into Jerusalem. So we're at, back in Mark 11, verse 12. Oh, no, that's, verse 12. No, it's not. 15, thank you. So I'm not going to read it anyway, I don't know why I need to know. Okay, so so he makes his way into Jerusalem, and he makes his way into the temple, and he's just kind of given this message, and he's about, if the message hasn't quite hit home for the people, it's about to kind of go up another level in the temple, because he goes into the temple, and he may not be hungry this time for figs from a fig tree, but he's still hungry, and he's hungry for the fruit of true worship. That's what he's looking for. That's what should be going on in the temple when he gets there. He's looking to find his people worshipping him and giving him, worshipping God, giving him glory. And instead what he finds is this marketplace. So he finds people buying and selling in the market. And he reacts in this way. He starts driving them out of the temple, doesn't he? He reacts in such a strong way. And if I'm honest, I find this part of the passage really difficult to imagine, because I'm much more comfortable with Jesus, meek and mild, Jesus, friend of sinners. I find this Jesus really uncomfortable. So in my head, Jesus would have gone into this temple, and it would have been much more fitting to his character to have kind of gently tapped some of these guys on the shoulder and kind of said, "Hi, I'm Jesus. Sorry to do this, but I'm so glad that you're here. I'm so glad you're in the temple. You're absolutely welcome to be here. It's brilliant that you're here. But this isn't great. This isn't what the temple's about. We're here to worship God. And you're buying and selling. I think you're overcharging. You're doing some other things that you really shouldn't be doing. It would be great if you could move this outside the temple, at least. Not now, because obviously you've gone to a lot of effort in a lot of hard work, getting this stuff all out. So maybe just finish the day, but." Okay. I'm giving you an insight into how I deal with difficult situations here. Anyway, yeah. So finish off your day, but just don't bring it back tomorrow. I hope that's okay. Sorry to be a pain. Something like that. That's how kind of Jesus does it in my head. But he doesn't, does he? He does it very differently to that. He does it much more like this.
Get out! Get out of my father's house! How dare you come in here and rob my father of his glory? My house is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. You've turned it into a den.
Okay, I'll clean it up later, I promise. Okay, yeah, sorry if you chose that moment just to rest your eyes for a few seconds. Sorry to the babies at the back, Rich. Anna, sorry. Okay, but I was wrestling whether to do that this morning or not, because I really didn't want to offend anybody. But I think it's important that we catch some of the offense. Yeah, that we feel some of what they would have felt, because what Jesus was doing was incredibly strong. Yeah, he was reacting to something really strongly in what he was seeing. His people were in danger. His people were doing things they shouldn't have been doing. They were at risk of withering. They were at risk of dying, being cut down. And he erupts in this anger. What on earth is going on here? And we need, again, a little bit of context to kind of get the full weight of this, because this whole scene is happening in the court of the Gentiles. Okay, so the temple complex was kind of split up into these different courts. You have the court of the Gentiles, the court of women, I think, the court of Israel, the court of Levites, and all of these courts kind of got progressively closer to the center of the temple, which was the most holy place, the place where God dwelt. And so this court, the court of the Gentiles, this was supposed to be the place where non-Jews, the Gentiles, this is the only place in the temple where non-Jews could come and worship God. So if these Gentiles, non-ethnic Jews, had realized that the God of the Bible, or the God of the Old Testament, the God of Israel, was the true and living God, and they wanted to give themselves in worship to him, this was the only place they could come and do it. And yet, because of this market, there's no space. There's no space for them in there. And perhaps if they do try and come in, they're going to end up getting ripped off by these people. What they find in the temple, instead of God's people worshipping the Lord with all their hearts, they're finding, God's people robbing each other and defrauding each other and ripping them off. And, no doubt if they came in and got ripped off, they weren't going to come back again. And I just think that's a really interesting picture, that actually when this sort of thing is going on, when there's a disconnect in the heart towards God, no matter how good we look on the outside, it's off-putting for people. When people come in looking for fruit that tastes good, and they find that kind of thing, it puts them off and they leave. And you think, well, I don't know whether they're ever going to come back. And more than that, perhaps for our own lives as well, when we are trying to be something that we think we're supposed to be, but there's a disconnect in our heart, it means that it doesn't leave any space for the parts of us that need a genuine touch from God. The parts of us that are broken. When we're trying to put on a facade, perhaps, there's no space for the parts of us that really need to come to Jesus and be touched and be healed. And there's a verse in Matthew's version of this account. I just want to read out one verse. You don't have to turn to it. Matthew's version is in Matthew 21, and it's verse 14, I think. It's just one verse. So just after he's driven these people out of the temple, in verse 14 it says, "The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them." We heard that, didn't we, a little bit earlier, about healing. There's healing on offer. Once Jesus has made room and cleansed the temple and driven the kind of these people buying and selling out, suddenly there's space. Suddenly there's space for the blind and the lame, the broken, the weak, the needy. And they all come in to Jesus, and they find in Jesus this welcome. He touches them, he heals them. He doesn't just kind of invite them in and welcome them in to come and just be blind and lame here in the temple rather than outside the temple. He touches them. He touches their eyes and opens them. He touches the parts of them that are lame and need healing and heals them. He turns their whole lives around. I can't think of anything more revolutionary than somebody who was blind now being able to see. He's completely transformed their lives. This is the kind of the welcome that comes to the blind and the lame, the excluded, the people that didn't have any space. And I think that's what God wants for us as a gathering, doesn't he? That there's space for the blind and the lame, whoever they are, whoever we are. But also in our own lives, that he wants us to bring those parts of us that are blind and lame, the parts that are, that just need a touch from Jesus. He wants us to bring them. He wants there to be space, that he would, get rid of the facade, get rid of the trying to do things that we think we should be doing and be real with the Lord, that he can heal us. And so I think this is all going on inside Jesus' heart when he walks into the temple. He's hungry. He's hungry for fruit. He's hungry for evidence that his people really belong to him. He's hungry for true worship. And yet when he walks into his temple, he sees God being robbed of his glory because the people were serving themselves. He sees them robbing each other and ripping each other off. He sees his people withering and dying. He sees the present danger of them being cut down. And he sees the people that desperately need a touch from Jesus, who desperately need Jesus, who want Jesus, they want to worship him, excluded and kept outside of the temple where they should have been welcomed. And he sees all of these things, and it's like his heart breaks. And he just erupts in this righteous anger. That's a small fraction, I think, of what we would have seen if we were there, seeing Jesus erupt in his anger, because this isn't what it's supposed to be. He's looking for true worship, hearts that are connected to him, not disconnected. And I think that's what he wants from us today. And so you see this incredible love of God towards the weak, the broken, the blind, the lame, these arms open, this healing touch on these people as they come to him in the temple. But my imagination just kind of runs a little bit, and I start to wonder, what about the guys he's just driven out of the temple? Is it over for them? Have they just blown it? Is that kind of like, sorry guys, you're not coming back? And again, I'm imagining this because it's not written in the account. But I should imagine that the vast majority of those people, when they were driven outside the temple, they probably got out of the complex and they were angry. And they were thinking, who on earth does this guy think he is, coming into my life, turning over my tables? This is my livelihood. This is what I do. Who does he think he is? He's got no right to come into my life and say these things and do these things. I'm coming back tomorrow, and I'm going to pick up my table, and I'm going to get my coins out, and I'm just going to carry on exactly as I left off, because he's got no right to tell me to do anything other than that. And I should imagine there were quite a few like that. But I'd like to think there were some who, having kind of heard what Jesus is saying and seen what he's just done, that as they found themselves outside the temple complex, it was as though their eyes were opened, as though they kind of woke up and they suddenly thought, what on earth have I been doing? What have I been doing? This isn't what the temple's for. It's a place to worship. God has done all these things throughout our history, and I've just been serving myself in there day after day. I should be worshipping him. I should be giving him my whole heart. And I'd like to think that in that moment they turned around and thought to themselves, I've got to get back in there. I've got to get back in there, and I've got to give God what he's due. I've got to give him my heart. I've got to give him my worship. And I think they probably came back in, not the same way they went out, but humble and repentant, turning. And I'd love to have seen it, the moment that perhaps their eyes just locked on to Jesus, and they're thinking in their mind, what on earth is he going to do? He's just kicked me out of here. What on earth is he about to do? Is he going to make a whip this time? I think he did that the other times. What's he going to do? Is he going to receive me? Is he going to reject me? And you can almost imagine the eruption of joy when they just see Jesus opening his arms towards them. These people he's just driven out of the temple for doing all the wrong things, for being all leaves and no fruit. He's just driven them out, and here they are. And Jesus, I'm sure, would have opened his arms wide to them and welcomed them back in, maybe given them an embrace. I'm sure he would have touched their lives. If they were spiritually blind, I think he would have healed them, touched the blindness. If they were lame or paralyzed in any way, he'd have touched them. Jesus, the same one that's just sent them out, now welcomes them back in, because they've come in different. They've come in repentant. They've come in wanting to get right with God. And you see, and I'm sure you would have seen, again, it's not written, I'm imagining this, but I'm sure you would have seen just the same welcome to these people that Jesus had just offered to the blind and the lame. That his heart is for people. He wants people to come in. And I remember Steve sharing a little while ago about, the judgment of God is at its heart is restorative, I think he said. I might have misquoted. But I think that's right. I think Jesus isn't just doing these things for the sake of it. He's doing it because he wants to provoke his people to respond. When he cast these people out of the temple, he didn't, that wasn't the end for Jesus. I think he was hoping. I think he was doing it that they would turn and come back in. I think he was trying to provoke this kind of response, that these people would come back in and they would receive a touch from him, and that he'd heal them. But I think that wouldn't be where he left it, because I think he would have said to these same people who have just come back in, you don't have to stay here. You don't have to stay in the court of the Gentiles. That's where we are. We're in the court of the Gentiles. If you're a Jew, there are other places you can go. You can go in deeper into the temple. If you're a Jewish woman, you can go to the court of women. If you're a Jewish man, you can go to the court of Israel. If you're a Levite, you can go in deeper still, and you can go to the court of the Levites. Jesus not only welcomes them back in, not only touches the parts of them that need touching, but his heart for them is that they would go in deeper into the temple, that they would go in deeper, kind of as far as they can possibly go, as far as they're allowed to go, and there, in that place, that they would worship God, and they would pour out their hearts, and they would give him everything they've got, everything that he deserves. And I think this is amazing, because obviously, in these days when Jesus is talking to these people, the temple is split up into these different areas, and people can only go so far. They're only allowed to go so far. And we know that kind of the courts are getting closer and closer to the center, which is the most holy place. And that was where God dwelt. And that was blocked off by a giant curtain. And only one person, the high priest, could go in there once a year to make atonement for the people. And so for these people, they could go in deeper, but they could only go so far. They could only go as far as they were allowed. And I think this is where it gets really exciting for us today, doesn't it? Because of Jesus, because of what he's done, because of the cross, because of his death, because of his resurrection, he has kind of opened up a way into the very center. He's opened up a way into the most holy place. Yeah. So when Jesus died on the cross, that veil, that curtain that blocked the entrance to the most holy place, it was torn in two, and suddenly there was a doorway that we could go through and go and live in the presence of God. And I think this is exciting for us because we can go in deeper. We can go all the way in, can't we? Today, we can go all the way in. These people, they could only go in so far. They could only go in as far as they were allowed. But for us, we can go all the way in. We can go right into the presence of God and live in his presence and worship him and pour out our hearts to him. And that's, I think, where Jesus wants all of us to be, whoever we are, whether we're blind, whether we're lame, whether we've just heard a strong word from God and we've turned and we're coming back in. Not only does he welcome us with open arms, not only does he heal us and touch us, the parts of us that need healing and touching, but he calls us to go in deeper, to go right in as far as we're willing to go, and we're allowed to go right in to the very center. And there we can stay, and we can worship God, and we can pour out our hearts to him. And actually, we get, just to finish probably, we get onto the very last part of the section, because I think it's from that place of living, in such close relationship with the Lord that mountains can get moved. And I think that's where Jesus goes as we get onto the last section. He kind of, they carry on their journey the next day and they see the fig tree. And Peter says, look, there's the fig tree that you cursed. And Jesus kind of gives this strange lesson, and it almost seems ever so slightly detached. Have faith in God. If anyone says to this mountain, go throw yourself into sea, and doesn't doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. And but it's connected to what's just happened. And I think what Jesus is doing, he's giving a really clear contrast to the people. A life where, there's a disconnect in your heart. No matter how good you look on the outside, it's going to lead to withering. It's going to lead to dying, right down to the roots. There's a very real risk of being cut down. It's a life without power. It's a life without joy. It's miserable. But if you'll come in, if you'll turn and you'll come, you can receive a touch from Jesus. You can be healed, and he'll take you right into the presence of God, and we can live there. That's where he wants us to live. And it's from that place of closeness with God that we can pray. Lord, the mountains represent impossible situations in our lives. And I can think of, lots of different situations, mountains that I would love to see thrown into the sea. But it's from this place of closeness with God that we can pray and see mountains be cast into the sea, this closeness of relationship. And that's the contrast, a disconnect in the heart between us and God. No matter how good we look on the inside, withers and dies. But lives that will come as we are, bring ourselves to Jesus and be changed and go in as deep as we can and worship. It's a life of power. It's a life where we can say to things, I think the mountains, they relate to things that cause us to be unfruitful in our lives, that we can say, whatever that might be, patterns of thinking, sin of some kind, we can say, be cast into the sea. Living in close relationship with Jesus. It's an amazing contrast, isn't it? And I think it's clearly where Jesus wants us to get to, and it's why he's willing to speak in this way and to act in this way, because he wants to shock his people out of this dangerous place and into this life of power and joy and freedom. It's wonderful, isn't it? I want to live there. I want to be there. I want to stay there with the Lord. I want to worship him. I want to pour out my heart and give him everything I've got. Lord, keep us from being all leaves and no fruit. Lord, keep us, speak to us if we need it, a strong word. I think this is the digging, isn't it? It's uncomfortable. It's the fertilizing of the fig tree. It's uncomfortable, but he's willing to do it because he wants to get us out of danger and get us into real life. I'm just going to finish just with this last bit, just because it's in the passage. Because it seems like Jesus, he's talking about a mountain, but he kind of names it specifically, as though it almost needs naming specifically, because he talks about unforgiveness. He just finishes with this, if you stand praying, if you're holding anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you. And I think it's important, just, that is a really clear barrier to living this life, isn't it? It's a really clear barrier. And I think the Lord's put it in there because he knows this stuff is really damaging, not just for us, but for other people. Because when, I'm sure we've all experienced it, when you go looking for fruit in somebody, who looks great, and you find nothing, there's a disappointment, there's a discouragement when you think, well, is this real? Does this work? And you can go away discouraged, or worse than that, perhaps you go looking for fruit in people, and instead of finding good fruit, you find bad fruit, and there's a hurt and pain that somebody who looked like they should know better, or they looked like they're living the life, and actually on closer inspection there was bad fruit. It can be really painful. And I think perhaps that's why Jesus has put this in here, that it's really important that we forgive, and that unforgiveness is a barrier to this whole thing, coming in to the presence of God and being close, in close relationship with the Lord. So it's a mountain that needs naming specifically. Forgive. If you're holding anything against someone, forgive them. And again, we have everything we need and more to do these things. We have this attentive gardener who is so longing for us to be fruitful that he'll get down in the dirt, and cut and prune and fertilize and do all these things to make us fruitful. God's heart is that we would be fruitful and live in this place where mountains can be moved. That's all that's on my heart. So.